The Voss family had been on Crazy Woman Creek south of Buffalo, Wyoming, for 11 years when Jacob Voss went under the ice at the Old Indian Ford on the morning of the 14th of February, 1893. He was 26 years old, the youngest of 3 Voss brothers, Volga German on both sides for 4 generations, born on a 4-section wheat farm outside the village of Norka, on the meadow side of the Volga River, 70 miles south of Saratov, on the 11th of January, 1867. Brought to America by his parents in the spring of 1881 to escape the Russian conscription edict of 1874 that had begun pulling Volga German boys into the Tsar's regiments at the age of 17 without warning and without exemption for the Lutheran faith. He had married Lillian May Reinhardt, also Volga German, also Lutheran, also literate in 3 languages, on the 17th of May, 1889, in the parlor of her father's stone foundation house on 12th Street in Lincoln, Nebraska, with 68 Volga Germans of the Lincoln colony in attendance, and his oldest brother, Otto Voss, standing as best man in a borrowed suit. He had brought her west by the Union Pacific to Cheyenne, and then by wagon north to the 320 acres he owned in 3 equal shares with his older brothers Otto and Wilhelm Voss on the South Fork of Crazy Woman Creek in late June of 1889, and they had built a small frame cabin together on the southern edge of the family's patent through the long, warm summer of that year, the 4 of them. And they had begun their own quiet life inside the larger and louder life of the Voss ranch. Their daughter, Anna Marie Voss, was born on the morning of the 14th of October, 1891, in the small frame cabin on Crazy Woman Creek, with the help of a Crow midwife named Pretty Owl, who had walked 5 miles down out of the Big Horn Mountains in a thunderstorm to be there. Anna Marie was a healthy 7.5-pound child, with her mother's pale blue eyes and her father's broad, square Volga German hands. She was christened Anna Marie at the small Lutheran chapel at the German settlement at Lone Tree Creek on the 3rd Sunday of November, 1891. Jacob carried her home on his saddle in front of him in a wool shawl in a snowstorm. Jacob went out at dawn on the 14th of February, 1893, to bring back a yearling calf that had drifted south of the home pasture during a 4-day cold snap. He found the calf alive on the south bank of Crazy Woman Creek at the Old Indian Ford a half-mile below the ranch house. He led the calf across the creek on the ice. The ice held under the calf. The ice did not hold under the horse and rider. Jacob went into water that was 38 degrees Fahrenheit at the bottom and capped with 2 inches of clear river ice on top. And although he climbed out, and although he walked the half-mile back to the ranch house with the calf on a lead rope in trousers that had begun to freeze on him in the first 100 yards, the cold had taken his lungs and his heart by the time he sat down on the kitchen floor at 3 in the afternoon. He passed at sunset in his own bed, with Lillian holding his right hand and his eldest brother Otto holding his left. Lillian was 24 years old. Anna Marie was 16 months. The ground on Crazy Woman Creek was frozen 4 feet down. Jacob was buried in the family plot on the south slope above the ranch house on the morning of 17 February, 1893, with the help of 3 neighbors and a coal-oiled torch laid in the bottom of the grave overnight to soften the ground. 3 weeks after the funeral, on the 8th of March, 1893, Otto Voss came down to Lillian's small frame cabin carrying a folded sheet of paper. The paper was a will. It was dated 9 August, 1892. It was signed in what looked enough like Jacob's hand to pass a justice of the peace in Buffalo. It left the entirety of Jacob's one-third interest in the 320-acre Voss patent, and the small frame cabin on the southern edge of it, and the 4 head of cattle that Jacob owned outright, to his brothers Otto and Wilhelm Voss in equal shares. It made no mention of Lillian. It made no mention of Anna Marie. It made no mention of the dower right that Wyoming territory had recognized since 1869. Lillian read the paper twice. She handed it back to Otto without a word. She knew enough English law and enough Volga German common practice to know that the document was a forgery, and she knew enough of Otto Voss to know that contesting a forgery in Buffalo with a German accent and no money would take 3 years she did not have. She asked Otto for 2 weeks to settle her things and to find a place for herself and her daughter. Otto granted 10 days. He took the 4 head of cattle out of the south pasture that afternoon. On the morning of the 18th of March, 1893, Lillian Voss loaded 1 wagon with everything she owned in the world. She took her mother's loom from Saratov and her father's cedar tool chest from Lincoln. She took 2 iron kettles, a wood stove, a coffee mill, a Bible printed in Stuttgart in 1863, the small cradle Jacob had built for Anna Marie in 1891, and a single wooden trunk. Inside the trunk, she packed 2 flat-iron stove plates, 3 feather pillows, 4 wool blankets from her own bed, and 12 heavy cavalry horse blankets her father Friedrich Reinhardt had been given by a quartermaster sergeant at Camp Brown in the Wind River country in 1876, when the United States Army was unloading surplus from the Black Hills campaign, and Friedrich had spent 3 weeks shoeing the cavalry's horses for free in trade for whatever the sergeant could pull off the wagons. The 12 horse blankets were 60 inches by 72 inches each. They were made of unscoured cavalry-grade wool, 3/4 of an inch thick, the natural lanolin still in the fiber, the standard regulation cavalry blanket of the United States Army between 1870 and 1880. They had been folded in Friedrich's cedar chest in Lincoln for 17 years. They smelled faintly of the high grass of the Wind River. Lillian had unfolded one of them once, in the parlor of her father's house in Lincoln on her wedding eve, in May 1889, and her father had told her that wool with the grease still in it would shed water all night long. She drove the wagon north out of the South Fork of Crazy Woman Creek, with Anna Marie on her lap and 2 old saddle horses tied behind, and she did not look back at the small frame cabin Jacob had built her in 1889. She filed a homestead entry the same afternoon at the Buffalo Land Office on a 160-acre quarter section on the North Fork of Spotted Pony Creek, 7 miles north of the Voss patent. The quarter she filed on was a north-facing slope, with 1 shallow draw of cottonwood at the bottom and 1 spring line 2/3 of the way up. It was the only quarter section within 15 miles of Buffalo that had not been claimed by anyone else, because it was on the cold side of the divide, and because the spring line froze 3 months a year. The land office clerk, a Pennsylvania man named Wesley Truitt, took her $2 filing fee and looked at the plat map and said that no woman had ever filed on the North Fork of Spotted Pony Creek before her. She said that no woman ever needed to before her. He gave her a copy of the receipt, and she folded it twice and put it inside the Stuttgart Bible. She slept the first 3 nights inside the wagon with Anna Marie under the 4 wool blankets from her own bed. On the 4th morning, the 22nd of March, 1893, she walked the quarter section corner to corner with her father's cedar tool chest on a hand sled and a length of hemp rope marked at every 12 inches, and she chose a building site on the south side of the cottonwood draw, where the wind off the divide would break against the rise above her, instead of cutting straight through her wall. She began to cut cottonwood on the 23rd of March. She had 31 logs sided and notched by the 18th of April. The cabin was 14 feet wide by 20 feet long. The walls were 7 courses high. The roof was a single shed pitch facing north. Framed in the cottonwood ridgepole and sheathed in split shake, she rived herself out of the same cottonwood with her father's froe. The cabin was finished on the 22nd of August, 1893. It had a single door on the south wall, 2 small window openings glazed with 2 panes of mica she paid 40 cents apiece for in Buffalo, a packed earth floor sealed with a thin slip of spotted Pony Creek clay, and a cast-iron wood stove she set on a flat bedrock outcrop in the southwest corner with a stovepipe punched through the south wall under the eaves. She moved into the cabin on the 24th of August with Anna Marie, who had begun to walk on her own that summer and who liked best the long, flat shelf of rock just west of the front door where her mother kept the iron kettles. She did not yet know what she would do for the inside walls. She had built the cabin tight, but she had built it of green cottonwood, which is a porous wood, and she knew from her mother's house in Saratov that any wall built green will pull warm, wet inside air through the wood toward the cold outside, and that the warm, wet air will turn to frost the moment it meets the cold inside face of the wood, and that the frost will then turn to liquid water when the inside air warms in the morning, and that the liquid water will freeze again at night, and that within 4 winters the wood will be black with rot from the inside out, and the cabin will be unfit to live in. She knew this because she had watched it happen to a green pine cabin built by a Volga German neighbor outside Lincoln in 1883. The cabin had been black with mold by 1887, and the family had lost 2 of 3 children to lung sickness inside it. She walked back to the wagon on the morning of the 25th of August, and she opened the wooden trunk, and she looked at the 12 cavalry blankets her father had given her, and she remembered what her father had told her in May 1889 in Lincoln, and she sat on the wagon tongue with Anna Marie asleep beside her, and she did the arithmetic. 12 blankets, 60 by 72 inches each, 14 by 20 by 7 feet of cabin, 3 full walls of cottonwood log to cover. The 4th wall, the south wall with the door and the windows and the stove flue, was the inside warm wall that would shed condensation outward through the door and the windows, and so it could be left bare. The 3 walls she needed to cover were the north wall, 20 feet by 7 feet, equal to 140 square feet, and the east wall and the west wall, 14 feet by 7 feet each, equal to 196 square feet together. 336 total square feet of inside log to cover. 12 cavalry blankets at 60 by 72 inches each gave her 360 square feet of wool. She had 24 square feet to spare for trimming and for the corners. She walked back into Buffalo on the 27th of August and traded a half day of weaving on her mother's loom for $1.10 in cash, and bought 80 linear feet of 1x2 split cedar lath strips at the lumber yard. She walked the strips back home on her shoulder in 2 trips of 40 feet each across 2 days. The cedar smelled of the Bighorn Mountains all the way home. She nailed the cedar furring strips to the inside face of every cottonwood log on the 3 walls she meant to line, fastening them vertically every 18 inches with hand-cut square nails she pulled from a fence on the abandoned Klein homestead 3 miles west. The furring strip stood out 1 inch from the log surface. She measured each strip's projection 3 times with a wedge of split cedar she had cut to exactly 1 inch thick. She unfolded the 12 cavalry blankets on the front step in the warm August sun, and she beat the 17 years of cedar dust out of them with a hickory rod for a full afternoon, while Anna Marie sat on the warm rock shelf inside the cabin and watched through the open south door. The blankets came clean. The wool fluffed back to its original 3/4-inch loft. The lanolin was still in the fiber. She held one folded corner to her face and could still smell the high grass of the Wind River country where the army horses had bedded down on these blankets in the summer of 1876. She hung the first cavalry blanket on the morning of the 2nd of September, 1893, at 6:15, with the sun just clearing the divide above her cabin. She started in the northwest corner of the north wall, with Anna Marie inside playing with a wooden spoon at her feet. She tacked the top edge of the blanket to the highest furring strip with 3 square nails through small squares of folded canvas to keep the wool from tearing. She stretched the blanket down across the wall. She tacked the bottom edge to the lowest furring strip the same way. She let the blanket lie flat against the cedar lath, with 1 full inch of still airspace between the back of the wool and the front face of the cottonwood log. She hung 6 blankets on the north wall, 2 side by side and 3 rows tall, with their long edges overlapping by 4 inches. She hung 3 blankets on the east wall and 3 blankets on the west wall in the same pattern. She finished the last west wall blanket on the morning of the 7th of September, 1893. She built 1 full inch of still airspace behind every blanket. She built 3/4 of an inch of unscoured cavalry-grade wool over every still air gap. She built a continuous vapor barrier of natural sheep's lanolin over every square inch of the cold inside face of every cottonwood log on the 3 exposed walls of the cabin. She built it in 5 working days, alone, with 1 toddling daughter on the rock shelf, with no neighbor for 5 miles, with no carpenter and no instruction book, and no second pair of hands, for the price of 80 cents of hand-cut square nails, $1.10 of split cedar lath, and 17 years of her father, Friedrich Reinhardt's patience in keeping a quartermaster's gift folded clean and dry in a cedar chest in Lincoln, Nebraska. She lit the wood stove for the first time that evening. The cabin held 68 degrees by sundown on a 45-degree September night. She slept on the rock shelf with Anna Marie beside her under 3 of the 4 bed blankets, and the inside surface of every cottonwood log on every covered wall was bone dry at sunrise. The cold came early in 1893. The first hard freeze on Spotted Pony Creek was the 17th of October at 14 degrees Fahrenheit. The first sustained snowstorm was the 2nd of November and dropped 11 inches in 18 hours. By the 15th of November, the temperature on the divide above Lillian's cabin was -18 degrees at sunrise. By the 7th of December, it was -30. The Powder River Basin was inside a stationary high-pressure dome of Arctic air that had drifted south out of the Yukon Territory in late October and had locked over Wyoming for the winter. The cold wave broke on the 6th of January, 1894, with a temperature of -45 Fahrenheit on the divide above Lillian's cabin, sustained without break for 4 days and 3 nights. The thermometer at the Buffalo livery stable read -39 the same morning. The thermometer at the Voss Ranch House on the South Fork of Crazy Woman Creek read -36. 11 souls were lost in Johnson County in those 4 days, 3 of them small children inside cabins built of green pine, where the inside walls had iced up in the 2nd week of December, and the families had stopped firing the stoves at night because the wet wood would not warm them. Lillian fired the wood stove in her 14 by 20 cabin with one armload of split hickory at 4 o'clock every afternoon and one armload of split cottonwood at 8 o'clock every evening for the entire 4-day cold wave. She had hauled 6 full cords of mixed hickory and cottonwood out of the spring draws of Spotted Pony Creek through October and November, and had stacked them along the south wall under the eaves where the late morning sun would dry the splits between snowfalls. She rotated the splits weekly across the long winter, oldest dry on the inside next to the cabin wall, newest cut on the outside. The cabin held 58 degrees Fahrenheit at the stove and 46 degrees at the rock shelf where she slept with Anna Marie under all 4 bed blankets. The inside surface of every cottonwood log on every covered wall was bone dry every morning of the cold wave. There was no frost ring. There was no condensation. There was no ice on the inside of the mica windows. The lanolin in the cavalry wool repelled the warm, wet inside air. The 1 inch of still airspace behind the wool blocked the heat conduction through the log. The cottonwood logs on the outside face froze solid at -45. The cottonwood logs on the inside face stayed at 28 degrees, dry and unfrosted. Anna Marie slept warm. She woke each morning of the cold wave wanting bread and her wooden spoon. Lillian gave her bread and her wooden spoon. The wood stove drew the smoke clean up the south wall pipe. The spring-line draw at the bottom of the cottonwood gully froze solid on the 2nd day of the cold wave, but Lillian had hauled 6 50-gallon barrels of water on the wagon in November and had stood them inside against the south wall, and they had not frozen. On the morning of the 11th of January, 1894, the 5th day of the cold wave, the temperature on the divide began to climb. By noon, it was -12. By sundown, it was 8 degrees above. Lillian opened her front door for the first time in 6 days and looked out across the white slope of Spotted Pony Creek toward the Bighorn Mountains in the south, and she went back inside and began the bread for supper. Otto Voss walked up the wagon track to Lillian's cabin on the North Fork of Spotted Pony Creek on the morning of the 14th of March, 1894. He had brought no horse and no wagon. He had walked the 7 miles north out of the South Fork of Crazy Woman Creek, alone, in his Sunday coat, in unmelted snow that came halfway to his knees on the divide. He had not shaved in 3 weeks. His face was thin and windburned, and his hands hung at his sides like the hands of a man walking up to a confession he had rehearsed in his own kitchen for 2 months and still did not know how to begin. He stood in the open front doorway of the 14 by 20 cabin, and he saw the warm room and the dry cottonwood logs above the dark wool blankets and the small girl on the rock shelf eating bread and butter with a wooden spoon, and the young woman at the wood stove with the long sleeves of her work dress rolled to the elbow, who had been his brother Jacob's wife, and who he had cast out of the small frame cabin Jacob had built her on the 8th of March, a year and 6 days ago, in a coat too thin for the wind that day. And he took off his hat, and he sat down heavily on the front step without entering, and he wept in front of his sister-in-law for the first time in the 32 years and 4 months of his life. The Voss Main ranch house on the South Fork of Crazy Woman Creek had lost the inside plaster off its north wall in the 2nd week of December, 1893. The horse barn had lost the loft floor to a frost heave the 3rd week of December. Wilhelm Voss had taken sick with lung trouble in early January and had been carried to the Buffalo doctor on the 8th of January in a wagon at -28 degrees. And the doctor had said that Wilhelm would have his right lung out by the spring and would never work cattle again. Otto had spent the cold wave alone in the kitchen of the ranch house with a sheet of canvas tacked across the ruined plaster and a bucket beside the stove for the meltwater that ran down the wall every time he opened the firebox. Otto sat on the front step of Lillian's cabin, and he asked her, in their grandparents' Volga German, whether she would teach him to do what she had done. Lillian Voss came out and sat on the rock shelf beside her daughter, and she said that she would. She said it without anger and without satisfaction. She said it the way a Volga German woman raised on the wheat steppe says yes to a brother-in-law who has come back to the table. She walked Otto along the inside of the north wall, and she showed him the split cedar furring strips and the 1-inch still air gap and the unscoured cavalry wool and the small folded canvas squares she had set under the square nails to keep the wool from tearing under load. And she explained to him in plain Volga German, the Volga German their grandparents had spoken in Norca in the 1840s before the long emigration, why the lanolin in the unscoured wool would shed the warm, wet inside vapor without absorbing it, and why the 1 inch of still air gap behind the wool would break the conduction path between the warm inside surface of the wool and the cold inside face of the cottonwood log, and why the cottonwood logs would stay dry and tight and unfrosted on the inside face all winter long, even at -45 Fahrenheit, even with 2 adults and an infant breathing inside a 14 by 20 cabin every night for 90 nights running. Otto walked back to the ranch house that afternoon and began the same week to strip the ruined plaster off his own north wall. By the 1st of May, he had nailed up split cedar furring on every interior wall of the ranch house, and the bunkhouse, and the smaller of the 2 horse barns. He had no cavalry blankets. He bought 24 heavy wool saddle blankets in Sheridan in late May at $3.50 apiece. He hung them on the inside of every wall. The Voss Ranch house held 62 degrees through the cold wave of the following January at -32 outside, and the inside walls stayed bone dry. Lillian Voss walked the Powder River Basin through the spring and summer of 1894, with Anna Marie on a hand sled in March and April, on the back of the older saddle horse from May onward, and she taught the lanolin wool vapor barrier and the 1-inch still air gap to 19 widows, 11 married women, and 4 old men in 8 counties from Johnson County, north to Sheridan and east through Campbell to the western edge of Crook County. She charged nothing for the teaching. She accepted a noon meal at every table she taught at, and she carried her own bedroll on the back of the saddle. 312 cabins in the basin had wool and air vapor walls by the 1st of December, 1895. By the autumn of 1898, the pattern had crossed the divide into Big Horn and Washakie counties on the western slope. The pattern was known across the Powder River country and the Big Horn Basin as the Voss Vapor Wall for 40 years. Lillian filed her proof of homestead on the North Fork of Spotted Pony Creek on the 11th of March, 1898, and received her patent on the United States government letterhead signed by President William McKinley on the 2nd of October, 1898. She did not remarry. She raised Anna Marie alone on the 160-acre quarter on the North Fork of Spotted Pony Creek through 24 winters in the same 14 by 20 cabin she had built in the summer of 1893. Anna Marie attended the small one-room schoolhouse at Pleasant Valley 4 miles east through 8 grades, walked 4 miles each way through the same Powder River winters her mother had survived, and then taught the school herself for 3 years between 1910 and 1912. Anna Marie married a Big Horn County rancher named Heinrich Stoltz of Graybull in the spring of 1912, in the small Lutheran chapel at Pleasant Valley, with 12 neighbor families in attendance, and a Crow elder named Walking Crane sitting in the back pew, and gave Lillian 4 healthy grandchildren by the autumn of 1921. Wilhelm Voss recovered enough lung function by the spring of 1895 to ranch in a small way, and lived to 1923. Otto Voss never married and walked the 7 miles north to Lillian's cabin on the 14th of March of every year for 31 years until the spring of 1924, when he was found in his own kitchen on the morning of the 15th of March, having passed quietly the night before of a stopped heart at the age of 63. Lillian was at his funeral with Anna Marie and her 4 grandchildren. She wore the same black dress she had worn at Jacob's burial on the 17th of February, 1893. Lillian May Voss passed quietly in her own bed on the rock shelf of the 14 by 20 cabin on the North Fork of Spotted Pony Creek, 7 miles north of Buffalo, Wyoming, on the morning of the 16th of May, 1948, at 7 minutes after sunrise. She was 79 years old, 3 months and 4 days. The 12 cavalry blankets her father had given her in March 1893 were still hanging on the inside walls of the cabin on the morning she passed. They had hung there for 55 winters. The lanolin had not failed. The cottonwood logs behind them were as dry and as tight as the day she had hung them. Anna Marie Stoltz, then 56 years old and the mother of 4 grown children of her own, had ridden the train from Grey Bull to Buffalo on the 11th of May, and had sat beside her mother through the long night of the 15th and the dawn of the 16th of May, and had held her mother's right hand at the end. The cabin was 62 degrees Fahrenheit at sunrise. The wool was clean. The walls were dry. A western cardinal was singing on the cottonwood ridgepole outside the south window when the breath went out of her. The cabin still stands today on the North Fork of Spotted Pony Creek, 7 miles north of Buffalo, Wyoming, on the same north-facing slope she filed on at the Buffalo Land Office in March 1893. It is a Wyoming State Historic Site, administered jointly by the Johnson County Historical Society and the Wyoming State Parks Department. The original 12 cavalry blankets were taken down in 2007 by Lillian's great-great-granddaughter, Margaret Stoltz of Sheridan, were professionally cleaned and stabilized by a textile conservator in Denver, and are now displayed inside the cabin in glass cases mounted to the same furring strips Lillian nailed up in August 1893. The original split cedar furring strips are still nailed to the inside face of every cottonwood log on every one of the 3 walls she lined in the first week of September 1893. The original 2-pane mica windows are still glazed in the original frames Jacob Voss never lived to see. The rock shelf is still in the southwest corner of the cabin, where Lillian and Anna Marie slept side by side under 4 wool bed blankets through the 4-day cold wave of January 1894. And on the inside of every cottonwood log, behind every preserved cavalry blanket, after 132 winters, the wood is still bone dry.